How did ancient people travel without maps? How did they manage? How did they imagine the world? By Historia Militum. I mean, I'm guessing like normal people don't really they don't really want to go too far, and then the important people they would have some map. Huh? Yeah, fair enough. Let's see.
When we think of the Roman Empire, most of us far too often, the first thing we imagine is its vast territory on a modern map.
I don't.
But it's crazy to imagine that the Romans might not have had scaled maps. So how did they know just how large their empire really was, or which direction they should next expand? Even more fascinating is how one was supposed to travel across 3 continents, passing through hundreds of cities they never heard of, when they didn't even have access to scaled maps. Or did they? This video hopes to answer all these questions and give you an idea of what it was like to travel in ancient Rome, and how likely you were to get lost while doing it. Let's first answer the question of whether or not the Romans had scaled maps. By this I mean maps that were made to scale, in which the map's distances were proportional to their actual size in the real world. Most modern maps are made to scale, and if we want to go from point A to B, they give us the ability to not only identify the fastest route, but also get a rough understanding of how much longer another route would take us. This is crucial information for efficiency and saving time. And if it weren't made to scale, a non-local could be fooled to think that another route was faster. And with no map at all, you might think the fastest route is something completely different. In terms of archaeology, no evidence of an actual scaled map survives to the present day. But this hasn't stopped many scholars from saying that they must have had such maps, placing all their trust on logic, probability, and a few questionable surviving Roman maps to prove that they indeed had them. After all, the Romans are credited with building large cities, complex road systems, and impressive feats of engineering. So how hard could it be to invent a scaled map? Today's video is sponsored by Filmora Wondershare. Their latest version, Filmora 14, offers many great tools to make video editing easier than ever. One of these is their AI clone feature, which allows you to change the voice of your narration for educational and diverse voiceovers. They also have an AI-generated subtitle feature which easily creates accurate subtitles on the spot and matches them to the video, making your videos more accessible to a wider audience, like non-native speakers. Additionally, Filmora provides tools for screen recording, keyframing, green screen, compared to my version of Vegas that I use. All these tools incorporate AI technology to make seamless and quick edits that could save you a lot of time and effort to work on other things like research. With Filmora, you could create professional and engaging videos with a high viewer retention in no time. Click the link in the description to try Filmora and elevate your content creation today.
I'll look after the video.
Our first example is a 3rd or 4th century mosaic from a rich villa in Amaidara, not far from the city of Carthage. It is a stunning map of over a dozen Greek islands in the Aegean Sea. But upon closer inspection, we can see that their sizes and locations are not at all accurate. Some of them, like Idalium and Paphos, for example, are cities on the same island of Cyprus, not separate islands. While Cnidus is not even an island at all, but a peninsula. It was thus concluded that this was not a map, but just a visual representation of stations along the route of a mystical journey of the goddess Venus. It was definitely not intended as a traveling guide. The next example comes from a century later. The Notitia Dignitatum is a document containing all Roman military units and the locations and forts they were stationed in. These here are maps of the provinces of Britain and Palestine, which only survive to our day because they have been redrawn several times through the Middle Ages. Although they resemble maps, no effort was made to display the forts geographically. Their positions and distances are completely arbitrary and aesthetic, and they were clearly never meant to be maps. Perhaps the most promising evidence of an ancient map is from another 100 years later in a Byzantine church in Jordan. This 6th century Madaba mosaic looks much more like a map. With the city of Jerusalem at its center, it depicts 157 cities and stations in the Holy Land, stretching along the Mediterranean shore from Sidon to Tyre to the Nile Delta. Although this beautiful mosaic...
I mean, it's one of the things where, like, the point and the idea of a map is to help you get somewhere or understand where somewhere is. But like, I guess you can call this a map, but how would this really help you? Like, for example, if you're in Jerusalem, I guess, so this is Jerusalem, I'm here, and like all this helps you is like, let's say I want to go to a city, I know it's what, northwest, northeast, like it gives you an idea of a general direction, but that's about it. Like, there isn't enough on the map to really tell you much more than that. But I guess it still counts as a map because at least it gives you a general direction. Fair enough.
They could fit part of the vague definition of a map. Notice that it does not include any roads. And if you tried to use it as a map to get from one side to the other, you could get seriously lost, as its scale varies between 1 in 600 and 1 in 15,000, meaning some locations could be up to 25 times further than they appear on this map. It is yet again a piece of visual representation, this time for a Bible reader, but not at all a geographical map for traveling.
Obviously.
So if there's no evidence of a proper Roman map, then how did they travel the world? This question is very important because the Roman Empire was the first instance when people would conduct large-scale and long-distance travel across Europe. In Rome's early days, most people in Europe were poor farmers who lived and died within the same 30 or so kilometers in which they were born. Only the most adventurous merchants and traders would travel long distances by land and would rely on locals to point them in the right direction, traveling from town to town to reach their destination. But as the Roman Empire started to expand, there was a growing demand for armies, contractors, traders, architects, and messengers to continually travel large swaths of land to administer and operate this colossal empire. Naturally, they still kept traveling from town to town. The only difference was they were now connected by proper roads, and there were so many towns and cities in the way that they would have to be written down as stations on a piece of papyrus or wax tablet. And so the first Roman travel itineraries were born, the only documents the Romans ever needed to travel. And we have a lot of evidence for them. A passage from the Historia Augusta notes how Emperor Alexander Severus gave instructions for his soldiers to travel. The dates of the itinerary were publicly displayed. 2 months before the event, he published an edict in which was written, "On that day at that hour I shall go forth from the city, and if the gods allow it, I will stay in the first station," detailing then the stations one after another, then the camps, and then where provisions are to be had, and all that for as long as one arrived at the barbarians' borders. From there, everything was silenced and all went without certainty lest the barbarians would know the Roman plans. So even official journeys to be made by the army were detailed as just a list of stations, dates, and times, without any mention of visual representations. This here is an example of a real Roman itinerary which may have been similar to those given to officers, only this one was likely made for a single traveler. It repeats 2 key words, mansio, meaning an overnight stop, and mutatio, meaning a remount. So after mounting up on your horse, you could travel 12 Roman miles, stop to spend the night, then travel 12 more until you reach a station where you can remount onto a fresh horse. You would then travel 8 more miles until you reach a city where you could spend the night. Next day you would travel 8 miles, remount, and then 10 miles before you stop to spend the night again.
System? Really?
By the end of the trip, you will have traveled about 213 kilometers or 132 miles from Turin to Milan in 7 days. This would be very impressive for a civilian traveler moving on public roads with occasional heavy traffic that somehow even had access to remount stations. Normally, such stations would only be a standard feature for those traveling with the cursus publicus, a fully state-funded private transportation system set up by Emperor Augustus, which provided private roads, fresh mounts, shelter, and other services to their users, allowing them to significantly cut travel time. But although this was the fastest way to travel across the empire, this service was reserved only for important officials, military officers, contractors, and messengers conducting special state assignments. And you would need legal permission in the form of a sealed document from the imperial administration to use this service. As an everyday traveler, you would need to use the public road network, which was fully completed by the 2nd century AD. And by the 4th century, all main Roman roads, along with 225 stopping stations, were compiled in a document called the Itinerarium Antonini, the itinerary of Emperor Antoninus Pius, one of the most important Roman travel documents surviving to our day. This is what it would look like if plotted on a modern map. You can notice the absence of scaled maps because not every main road is the fastest path from point A to B, and most travelers would not have been aware of this. Only the locals of any area would know the fastest routes through shortcuts and small roads, the thousands of which are not even present on this itinerary for the average traveler. But even so, there were many advantages for travelers to stick to the main roads, even if they were longer. Not only were they better and much safer, but they passed through large cities which provided better facilities for housing, shopping, bathing, and other traveler needs. Such large itineraries were likely used as databases, from which a traveler could copy the specific distances and stations they needed to reach their destination, without having to carry the entire thing. Now we can understand why Emperor Alexander only had to display a list of stations to make sure his soldiers knew where to go.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Another example of traveling comes from Galen, a successful scholar and physician describing the location of Hephaestus on Lemnos, an elusive island in the Aegean Sea which took him several tries to find. When I had crossed from Italy to Macedonia, and when I had traveled through nearly all of it, I got to Philippi, a city in the vicinity of Thrace. From there, I reached C, some 120 stadia away, and from there
it makes me like, obviously it's been like, it's been a long time, but even then it makes me embarrassed sometimes, like when I was younger and I had no phone with GPS, right? And you feel kind of lost, like when you go to a new city for something, you have to ask random people. Sometimes you go to the tourism office and they might give you a map, but I'm not someone who can read a map. Yeah, I know, embarrassing. And yeah, I remember having like quite a few times when I was young, like that kind of experience. And even with GPS, like I've had time, even with the GPS where, especially when I live in the countryside, I felt kind of lost, right? Like, I don't know. Despite like the amount of modern knowledge we have of every road, every passage, every city, the distance of it and all that, there's still like something about the feeling of, like once you're in an unfamiliar place with a map or not, with a GPS or not, you still feel kind of lost.
First sailed to Thasos, some 200 stadia, and from there some 700 stadia to Lemnos. From there another 700 to Alexandria Troas. I have written about my journey and the stadia extensively, so that anyone who might, like me, want to visit Hephaestus knows its location and can arrange for the journey accordingly. This text tells us a lot about how the Romans thought of travel and geography. Despite being a highly knowledgeable man working for the imperial court, Galen, with all his education and access to the empire's resources, did not have any knowledge on how to find this island, which strongly implies the absence of geographical maps. Even many of his contemporary Roman geographers like Ptolemy, Pausanias, and Strabo similarly exclude any visual representations, and describe the geographical locations of rivers, mountains, and tribes across the entire known world in written format. Like this river flows from the Alps to the Mediterranean, or this mountain range encompasses all of Pontus, but nothing overly specific. This is likely why Galen had to resort to paying a local captain to show him where the island is. But even he failed in this task. And when Galen does finally find it, he decides to describe its location to future travelers in the only way he knows, as an itinerary, rather than drawing a map or a rough diagram. Though this might seem more primitive compared to modern travel maps, we actually still do the same thing today. Most people wouldn't use a paper-scaled map for travel, but would instead break their journey down into a list of subway stations, bus stops, and intersections. And if at any time you got lost, you could just ask a local to point you in the right direction, which is probably why Galen wrote down the distances but didn't bother to mention any directions, because you could just ask a local at Thasos to tell you which way Lemnos is, or you can read a road sign.
Talk to people, touch grass.
We can even break up all of Europe into a simple itinerary that's much easier to understand than a scaled map. If you need to go from Rome to London, you could just take one road to Stuttgart, then another to London. and neither the curvature of the land nor the need for a ferry is actually that important.
Fair enough.
Looking at the world like this actually has little risks, but you could, for example, fail to realize that two different stations on two different itineraries are actually on the same island, which would explain why on the island mosaic, Idalium and Paphos are listed as separate islands when they are in fact both on Cyprus. It is because the artist was basing it off an itinerary. Obviously, the locals of any island would know exactly how many cities they had, but foreign travelers might not. One of the most important features of the Roman road network were its milestones, positioned at every Roman mile along every Roman road. These were useful for not only reassuring yourself that you're going in the right direction, but also for
That's where the word milestone comes from?
telling you how much longer you have to go, as they each had an engraved number representing the distance to or from the terminal point of the road, and occasionally both. For example, there was a famous milestone called the Golden Milestone, which was placed in the middle of the city of Rome, to mark the center of the empire. As you walked a mile away from it along any road, you would find another milestone telling you that you are 1 mile away from the center of Rome. After you get to your destination at the 100th milestone, for example, you would simply have to count the milestones backwards from 100 to return to the city. And at any time you would know exactly how much you traveled, how much longer you had to go, and how better to pace yourself for the journey ahead. This is the most practical way to travel from one place to another, and it could only get a bit confusing when you come across a crossroad. But as common as that is today, most areas in ancient Rome would just have one main road cutting through it, and most journeys would never reach an intersection of two main roads. For the more long-distance journeys, however, you could come across many crossroads, and would have to refer to a carefully annotated itinerary, probably drawn from a database in your area, like the itinerary of Antoninus. Nevertheless, visual itineraries also existed, and Vegetius clearly mentions them when explaining how a general must react to an emergency. Indeed, the more conscientious generals reportedly had itineraries of the provinces in which the emergency occurred, not just annotated but illustrated as well, so that they could choose their route when setting out by the visual aspect as well as by mental calculation. What Vegetius is referring to is an itinerarium pictum, an itinerary that was both annotated and illustrated, and we have a beautiful example of this in the form of the Tabula Peutingeriana, which was once again preserved through the Middle Ages. It is a 7-meter or 22-foot-long papyrus of the ancient world, detailing routes from Britain to India. It even represents geographical knowledge in the form of rivers, mountains, and the rough positioning of cities. This here is the easily recognizable boot of Italy, surrounded by Dalmatia, Sicily, and the North African coastline. Most importantly, it includes the many intersections and roads with labeled distances, likely taken from the Antonine itinerary, which technically makes it an ancient map, useful for immediately visualizing different regions, shortcuts, and all cities in close proximity, which would take much longer to understand with only a long list of written itineraries. My favorite feature is that every zigzag on a road represents the need for an overnight stop, so you can visually estimate the duration of your trip. But although it can be labeled as a map, it is actually a topographical diagram, meaning it disregards both scale and accuracy of direction for the sake of being easier to read and travel by, just like our simplified map of Europe or any modern subway diagram. Even some rivers and mountains are incorrectly placed, implying that not a lot of effort went towards making it geographically accurate. The original time period of this map remains unknown, as it includes both the city of Pompeii, which was destroyed in 79 AD, and the city of Constantinople, which was founded in 324. But regardless, it is very unlikely that most Romans traveled with illustrated itineraries, as they seem more suited for governors or generals who prioritize geographic and territorial information.
It's definitely not for the random.
Nevertheless, it represents a crucial step forward in the representation of geographical information, which eventually grew into our modern scaled maps.
I think there's supposed to be a new one.
What's funny is that in 1931 we actually took a step backwards in this evolution, when a part-time draftsman in London by the name of Henry Beck suggested replacing the city's accurate scaled maps with topological diagrams, which would, like the Roman itinerary, disregard geographical details, scale, and the accuracy of direction, but would make understanding it and commuting much easier. His idea was initially rejected, but was later tested and proved so successful that it became the standard for all maps of regional transport all over the world. Now, if there's one conclusion we always seem to reach in our videos, it's that the Romans were very practical people. If something wasn't absolutely necessary, they likely wouldn't do it at all. So if developing scaled maps wouldn't help anyone more than a simple itinerary would in getting from point A to B, then why would they even bother? If you're interested in travel during the Roman period, let us know in the comments below.
That's super interesting.
Thank you so much to the patrons that helped to make this video. If you wish to join our team, you can do it through the link in the description. I hope to see you all in the next one.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, that's more or less what I figured as far as, like, you know, most of the like regular people would not travel that much anyway. But I guess the higher level people, they would have some way to know where they're going. But it's still kind of like, yeah, it's probably a lot of word to mouth asking where you're going, right? And I guess you still do that today. You know, you could use a GPS, but sometimes, you know, it's probably easier sometimes to just ask people where someone is, where something is. But I'm always impressed anytime I watch anything about, like, technology and practicality of stuff in the Roman Empire. I'm always very impressed. So super interesting. Great video. Which one is more important? I mean, president definitely still has more power, yeah. Yeah. Like, prime minister is really like, I mean, I don't know too much because I don't follow too much. Prime minister has some power, but, you know, more often than not, is still seen more or less as a mouthpiece of the president, right? Generally, except in these trying times right now, I guess. Obviously. This was super interesting. Okay.